Leader of the Third Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great honour for me to be able to stand here to speak in support at second reading of Bill 38, the Climate Accountability Amendment Act. Let me start by saying I thank the Minister of Environment for bringing this in. This was a lot of work, I know, bringing it in. There were many, many hours of discussions about the importance of various targets, the sectoral targets, interim targets, and it's been one of the highlights of my time in this legislature, Honourable Speaker, has been the pleasure of working with the Minister of Environment in developing both this climate accountability legislation as well as the Clean BC before that. And I mean that in all sincerity, and I raise my hands and thank the Minister for his work in this effort. You know, incorporating a rigorous accountability framework into the climate policies we have jointly developed with government was not only a key priority for me. It was a clear condition of our continued collaboration with this government. And I'm very pleased that it has continued to this day and will continue in the foreseeable future. As a climate scientist, Honourable Speaker, I know that transparent, accurate, timely and publicly accessible data is absolutely crucial to achieving our climate commitments and actually to ensure that the public trusts government that it will deliver into it. For words like trust us are simply not good public policy. Now, Honourable Speaker, throughout my scientific career, I've advised and criticised numerous governments on their climate policies. And the member from Langley just discussed some of the earlier issues with respect to his government under the leadership of Gordon Campbell, where indeed very fine climate policy, quite internationally leading at the time, was brought into the province of British Columbia. Unfortunately, many other jurisdictions bring this, as well as in BC as well, bring these policies forth and then fail to live up to the commitments that they brought it forward to actually address. That is true not only of the previous government, where in 2010 the commitment to this issue essentially fell by the wayside as the leaders changed, and ultimately, Honourable Speaker, that's what prompted me to run for politics. What prompted me to run for politics was being part of the previous administration's climate action team, meeting with the Premier at the time numerous times on an ongoing basis, meeting with the Cabinet to have presentations on climate science, really fruitful discussions with stakeholders. To me, that was, you know, a government that understood the direction that was needed to go and recognized, as all governments should, that every single environmental challenge really is nothing more than an opportunity for innovation and prosperity in addressing that challenge. So I ran, Honourable Speaker, as you know, in 2013 because I felt that we'd lost our way in BC. And I'm very pleased to say that I think that now we're seeing the way actually moving forward in a direction that will address this problem. Perhaps not to the extent that I'd like, perhaps not to the extent that some others would like, but certainly as a leader in North America in terms of pathways to emissions reductions. Let me consider a couple of major reports that have been published this last year, Honourable Speakers, to put some context of why we need to deal with this and why the Accountability Act is so important to ensure that transparency moving forward is there for not only government but also for the people of British Columbia. As you will note, in 2018, the IPCC released a special report in which the world's leading climate scientists warned that there are, we don't have a lot of time if we want to keep warming to below 2 degrees. And to be perfectly blunt, we know that the world has already warmed, Honourable Speaker, by over 1 degree. We know that we have a committed warming of about 0.6 degrees to existing levels of greenhouse gases. Now, my friend opposite from Langley mentioned about the importance of reducing coal emissions from China, and I concur. Coal is a significant source of greenhouse gases, but what is not often said is coal is also a significant source of particulate matter and black carbon. Now, particulate matter that actually, these so-called aerosols in the atmosphere, actually cool the planet. And one of the ironies of actually replacing coal with natural gas is particulate matter decreases. And when the particulate matter decreases, its effect on not only cloud formation, but also on the direct scattering of radiation back to the sun is that we get an amplification of the warming. So in fact, it's not quite as simple as saying replace coal by natural gas, we get less warming. Because in fact, replace coal by natural gas, and there's a warming jump as the particulate matter associated with the coal is scrubbed out of the atmosphere. So as I said, we've already warmed by 1 degree. We have 0.6 degrees committed warming to existing levels of greenhouse gases, and not a single climate model in the world, Honourable Speaker, has actually accounted for the permafrost carbon feedback, which we know will add another 0.2 to 0.3 degrees. So even this notion that somehow we're going to keep warming to below 1.5 degrees is really not on. And you can see that in the IPCC reports. The IPCC report, this special edition one, quite clearly indicates that negative emissions are required in order for us to meet the 1.5 degree target. That doesn't mean we can't meet the 2 degree target, but negative emissions. But again, so some might take this as something to be distraught about. But rather, again, we should be viewing this as an incredible economic opportunity. Negative emissions means economic opportunity, means taking carbon out of the atmosphere, means companies like Carbon Engineering in Squamish are potentially game changers in our broader society. And that's the kind of technology and knowledge initially started by a friend of mine, David Keith, who's now at Harvard, that could actually game change the world. And it's here in BC. And I'll come back to that in a bit. A few months after that IPCC report, Honourable Speaker, Canada's Changing Climate was published by the federal government. And in that, the report noted, what the scientific community has known for a very long time, that northern Canada is warming at twice the rate, global rate, and that's no surprise to anybody who's been in this field. But it also talked about BC as being particularly vulnerable to drought. We've seen that in recent years. Glacier loss, well, I can tell you from the work done by a fellow friend of mine named Sean Marshall at the University of Calgary, is all the southern glaciers in British Columbia will be gone this century. And that's really something we can't stop. And there's very profound effects with that will occur as a direct consequence of that. Then there's also issues with respect to sea level rise. It's quite complex because of the way that sea level rise is not a global rise. There's regional differences. And I suspect there'll be some issues moving forward in the Delta and in terms of salination of existing farmland. Now, Honourable Speaker, shortly after that report, the UN Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services put out a report that stated that in stark terms that we're in the midst of an extinction crisis, with 1 million species likely disappearing within the next few decades. Now, again, if you've been working in this field since the 1980s, like I have, there's nothing new in that report. The report is essentially pointing out that the 6th greatest extinction event in Earth's history is occurring as we speak, in the Anthropocene, a profound consequence of global warming. And the consequences are not only on land, but in the oceans in particular as a direct response to ocean acidification. Because the single biggest sink for the carbon in the atmosphere is the ocean, and when the ocean takes up that carbon, it becomes less, it acidifies, and what that does, it makes it very difficult for calcium carbonated bearing shelled species to make their shells, and in some cases they dissolve, which is one of the reasons that most of the world's reefs will go extinct in the next couple of decades, and there's very little we can do about that. And again, when we look in historic times, the last time we had kind of acidity levels change like this, as a direct consequence of volcanism, that's volcanoes for many tens and hundreds of millions of years, we saw 80 to 90% of marine species going extinct, because what happens when you kill the corals, and they're going in this century, you kill the life around the corals and the biodiversity food chain starts to collapse. So this is yet another consequence that was warned by the UN Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Again, very significant challenge. Also could be viewed as a very significant opportunity for innovation for those jurisdictions that recognize this for what it is, a challenge that is also an economic opportunity. Well, then we get, of course, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Professor Alston said the world is on course for climate apartheid. They're quite strong words. But what he's saying here is, or what Professor Alston is saying, is that the rich will be able to buy their way out of the worst effects of global warming and the poor will suffer the least. Even under the best case scenario, he wrote, hundreds of millions will face food insecurity, forced migration, disease, and death. Now, again, another stark warning, and again, for those in the field, it's no surprise that this came out because there's nothing new in that as well. If you simply plot GDP as a function of latitude, ignoring a few outliers like Singapore, you find that those jurisdictions that are economically prosperous tend to be further away from the equator. And then if you ask the question, where will climate change, global warming manifest itself the worst? Of course, it will be in the sub-Saharan areas, the subtropical areas, which will get drier. It'll be with the desertification of southern Europe, very profound problems there, the potential changes to the Indian monsoon and sub-Saharan Africa, places like that. So there are some very serious consequences. But these jurisdictions, you can imagine, Honourable Speaker, have not been part of the problem because the climate system does not actually care about emissions in any given year. It cares about the cumulative emissions. It's a stock and flow problem in the language of economics. We know how much more we can put into the atmosphere to keep warming in a probabilistic sense before some level. We know how much is coming in and we know how much we can take out. And so the question then comes, do we as a collective society believe that we should be dealing with this problem, yes or no? I'm pleased that this government is suggesting the answer to that should be yes and is hoping to do its part in that regard. Moving to the reports, this past summer, Honourable Speaker, we had the province quietly releasing its strategic climate risk assessment for British Columbia. A really interesting report. I would quibble with one of the potential conclusions of it, the low risk to Lyme disease, when in fact we know within the scientific community for quite some time that vector-borne diseases are moving northwards simply because the carriers of such diseases, whether it be mosquitoes or ticks, are moving northwards as well as a direct consequence of warming and warmer winters. You know, we then can move to last week, the climate transparency analysis of the G20 nations, and they found that Canada, Honourable Speaker, is in the top 3 countries furthest off track from meeting their emissions reduction targets. And the Canadian target really hasn't changed since Mr. Harper was our Prime Minister. And it's ironic that we went through this last federal election with parties climbing over themselves, trying to argue they have the most progressive policies towards greenhouse gas reduction, when in fact the targets that we're aiming for were put in place by the Conservative government, have been unchanged, and very little has actually been done to reduce emissions nationally in Canada, although some good work has been done in terms of movement towards phasing out coal-fired electricity plants. But the replacing of coal-fired with natural gas, particularly when that natural gas comes from horizontal drilling and fracking, highly subsidized, is not clear to me that, in fact, you're actually getting ahead in the greenhouse gas game because of the fugitive emissions associated with horizontal drilling. You know, our per capita emissions, Honourable Speaker, are 18.9 tons. The average per capita emission in the G20 is 7.5 tons. You know, we talk a really good game, Honourable Speaker, in Canada, and BC, we are very environmentally conscious, but the data often tell a different story from the game we talk, particularly at the national level. Although the country is looking to the leadership of Quebec and British Columbia, Quebec has actually continued to be a leader in per capita emissions in this country. British Columbia was on track to recognizing the economic opportunity associated with decarbonization until about 2010. And then we started this, quest for the impossible. And even today, to this date, there's still people believing that our economic prosperity lies somehow in staying stuck and chained to the economy of the last century through natural gas extraction, as the rest of the world is a glut in said product. Honourable Speaker, in 2016, the most recent global data available from the International Energy Agency of the United Kingdom's per capita emissions were this: 5.65 tons per capita of CO2 equivalent. New Zealand was 6.45 tons CO2 equivalent. Norway, 6.78. Now, Norway is actually a very northern nation and a strong oil and gas producer. They followed the lead of people like Peter Lougheed in Alberta, recognizing that the prosperity that they gave from the extraction of this resource, which they knew was a sunset resource, should be put aside for tomorrow so that their society could benefit from the ways of the former governments and people who didn't have alternatives before them. And they are a very prosperous nation now, poised very well to take advantage of the opportunities moving forward with greenhouse gas emission reduction. Denmark's 5.84. Sweden, 3.83. Sweden, another northern nation. You know, this puts the average British Columbia carbon footprint, Honourable Speaker, at 2.3, 2, 1.9, 2.2, and 3.4 times larger than that of the average person living in the UK, Norway, New Zealand, Denmark, and Sweden, respectively. And if we go to a country in Africa, let's say Chad, for example, the multiples are hundreds, not 2 to 3. Which brings me back to my opening sentiment, Honourable Speaker. Climate policy rhetoric is nothing without transparent, accurate, and timely and publicly accessible data, and political promises are worthless without legislative accountability. And it is for exactly that reason that this bill, in my view, is so important, because it gives the public the transparency, as I'll outline in a second, the information on which they can hold government account. And frankly, it can give opposition parties the transparency and information that they can hold government to account. And it signals out the direction that government wishes to take to see sectoral reductions, recognizing that such reductions will not be legislated but are guiding principles. This sort of transparency is important for holding government for account and, frankly, for government to actually think this through in greater sense to ensure that they're following the path for which they've committed. It's my sincere hope that the transparency and accountability mechanisms in the bill, if passed, will last well beyond the current government and set an evidence-based foundation from which future climate policy can be built with whatever government happens to be in place at that time. You know, we have an awful long way to go, Honourable Speaker, but the amendments included in this bill add some real credibility to the Clean BC plan. And again, I come back to these last 2 years when I go back to 2018 when I'm sitting on holiday and I read the newspaper and I hear that the Premier's off to go to Asia to stump for LNG. And I would describe those times as the challenging times for the relationship between the BC Green Caucus and the present government. But what has happened in 2 years since then is really quite remarkable. I've seen a government actually recognize the challenge is an opportunity. We've seen Clean BC come through. I recognize that there's an LNG plant embedded with that, and I'm very cynical about the ability to deliver our targets with that. That's for me to take with me when I move on and as I'm not running again. However, government has actually had to balance the competing interests and done a good job in bringing Clean BC, and it's been an honour working with the Premier and the Minister of Environment in helping develop that plan, and particularly the civil service as well, and the staff in my office. But that wasn't enough. I mean, that happened after legislating some targets. What was really important is this bill here, because Clean BC gives some guidance as to what government's going to do, but it is the reporting measures and the transparency and the accountability component of that will allow others to judge whether government is or is not successful. And again, it was a great pleasure working with government on this bill. I will say that one of the highlights, in fact, the highlight of my time in this office was, unfortunately I wasn't able to attend, was being, quite ironic actually, receiving as a co-recipient of a Clean Capitalism Award. I love the fact that the Minister of Environment also was a co-recipient of a Clean Capitalism Award from a government not often known for capitalism. It's from the Delta Group in Clean 16 award we received in October the 7th of this year. That showed that others actually recognize that when people work together on issues that transcend traditional partisan boundaries, you can get a lot done. And actually, the sum is much greater than the whole. The whole is certainly much greater than the sum of the parts. If we had been government, I don't think we would have done what was being done, and I don't think the NDP, frankly, would have done what they've done if we weren't in this situation, being forced to work together. And that has led to actually what I believe is some good public policy in this regard. And again, I come back to how pleased I have been to work with the Minister. I think I've said that enough now. I think that's on record. And the member from Vancouver West End. It's always a pleasure working with the member from Vancouver West End as well. We've got a long way to go, of course, but the amendments included in this bill actually do, as I say, add real credibility to the Clean BC plan. So the main components of Bill 38 that we're debating at second reading here are as follows. There's a requirement for government to set an interim emissions target on the path to a legislated 2030 target, which is 40% greenhouse gas reductions below 2007 levels. Now, why this is important is this parallels exactly what happened back with the previous Liberal government under Gordon Campbell when the Climate Action Team was put together, and they were tasked with coming up with said interim targets, which were legislated, and we're not requiring government to legislate, but rather to come up with targets. And the reason why these are important is because you can actually assess the trajectory to where you want to go in a time frame that's relevant to electoral cycles. Obviously, a 10-year target is several electoral cycles from now, and when you start to have interim and sectoral targets, you're starting to be held to be more accountable. And in fact, under the leadership of Gordon Campbell at the time, the 2012 target was actually met. And we were on track to meet the 2016 target until this folly of pursuing the impossible and the complete abandonment of climate policy occurred in around just after 2010. So the bill also includes a requirement for governments to set separate 2030 sectoral targets following engagement with stakeholders, Indigenous peoples and communities throughout the province. Now this, again, is also important. This isn't about legislating a sectoral target. It's about providing the transparency to ensure that the public and the sectors have a sense of what government's thinking, that this is a signal to broader society that this is the direction we're going ahead. Now, I recognize there'll be some industries out there absolutely, going beside themselves thinking that somehow they're going to be targeted. Now, this is not about legislation. This is about guidance and about sending a signal to which government will be held account, as well as to which industry will be able to see the direction and the signal government's sending. It's going to ensure the responsibility to reduce carbon pollution is effectively distributed across BC's economy and between ministries. And the Minister of the Environment, of course, alone cannot tackle the entire challenge, as much as some of us would like him to have this multi-ministerial portfolio embedded in others as well. There's also a requirement for government to table an annual report on actions taken to reduce carbon emissions, along with their cost and how they will achieve government's legislated emission reduction targets. And this annual report, or these reports every year, will outline the latest emissions data and projections, as well as actions planned for future years and the effect they are expected to have. Imagine it's sort of like the budget process, whereby we put out a 3-year fiscal review in the budget. Here, government will put out a multi-year kind of assessment as to where emissions will go on an annual basis. The report will also include a determination of climate risks our province is facing, and that's not going to have to be changed every year. I mean, the first one's going to be written, and then they'll be kind of increased incrementally as time goes on. And it'll include a discussion of risk reduction policies that are to be taken and any mitigation or adaptation plans. And to be perfectly blunt, I think we need an all-hands-on deck on the adaptation side, because I've been watching this file since the 1980s, and I've watched year after year, emissions target after emissions target be ignored. And I'm hoping British Columbia will continue down that path, but we cannot ignore the fact that adaptation is going to be critical. Embedded in the report is also, Honourable Speaker, a requirement for government to establish an independent advisory committee that will be modelled on the Climate Solutions and Clean Growth Advisory Council now that the Council has fulfilled its mandate. And again, this is an important external agency that's not just a validation group, but rather is a group that would be engaged with a variety of stakeholders to ensure that stakeholders are engaged in government's thinking as they move forward in terms of reporting and accountability, and that any issues that often are not the sole purview of one minister, but actually are brought to the government by stakeholders, can have a conduit to get there in a timely fashion. So the committee will hopefully be made up of members from diverse areas of expertise and regions and from across the province, and they'll be providing the minister advice on things like policies that can lead to further reductions. Some of that, I recognize that many people who sit on these committees are not actually policy experts. They have good ideas, and that we must rely upon the civil service to develop the said policies. However, a lot of good ideas can be brought forward from these stakeholders for which government can actually develop the necessary policies. This group will also examine progress towards targets and raise opportunities for sustainable economic development, opportunities for climate change mitigation and adaptation, among other matters that are related to this Act. And lastly, Honourable Speaker, this bill gives government the ability to set more detailed targets and other environmental standards for publicly owned buildings and vehicular fleets to help reduce emissions, improve environmental performance, save money and support innovations. So again, coming back to what the member from Langley pointed out, many of these amendments build on policies that were actually first introduced under Premier Campbell's Liberal government. And that's not to say that, one government's better than the other. It is, what I'm trying to point out here is it's very positive when we can recognize that issues like this transcend political boundaries. We have good work done by the Liberals in 2007, 8, 9. We have good work being done by the BC NDP in 2018, 2019, and soon to be 2020. And that is a testament to the desire within British Columbia for climate policy to be central to our decision-making. And I'll come to that later. As I mentioned, I was a member of Gordon Campbell's Advisory Council in 2007 and 2008, when he first introduced the first comprehensive price on carbon to set greenhouse gas reduction targets as well, and also developing interim targets, that the first proper revenue-neutral celebrated carbon tax. And I remember the cynicism at the time, and I was quite upset when many people that I knew who were with the now government were riding this axe to tax kind of rhetoric. It was particularly upsetting, but frankly, I knew it was going to flop because that campaign started in the summer, right in the peak driving season, and everyone knows gas prices are going to drop in the fall. So the campaign was initiated just as the gas prices went up, and when the fall came, campaign fell through the floor because the gas prices had gone down. And frankly, I think the now government learned from that and have been quite progressive in terms of pushing for this ever since. There's no doubt that what Campbell did in 2007 and 8 was groundbreaking. But now, honestly, it's due for an upgrade. And that is what the present government is doing, is taking that to the whole new level. And one of the first signs of that was in our agreement with the Confidence Supply Agreement, was the actual continuation of the carbon tax from $30 to $50, $5 a year ahead, to show Canadian leadership to meet the $50 target that Trudeau is going to bring forward, a year before the rest of Canada, but at the same time recognizing the importance of giving price certainty to the business sector, and that is done through incremental $5 a year changes. The government deserves a lot of credit for following through with that, and frankly, I have not heard complaints from the general public, because the general public actually believes in that. But what they do have some reluctance in believing in, Honourable Speaker, is corporate subsidies that allow certain polluters to not pay the carbon tax, whereas individual citizens must continue to pay it. And I'll come back to that too. So while British Columbia, Honourable Speaker, already has, I'm the designated speaker, Honourable, and I'm getting really into this speech, so I'm a little bit more. The British Columbia has already legislated greenhouse gas reduction targets, as well as a requirement to collect data for tracking emissions. But I've tried to say we can do better. Our targets are set 10 years apart, and data is published on a 2-year delay. Combine that with a 4-year government mandate, and you create a situation where political parties, as we all know, blame each other, spend the first 2 years blaming their predecessors for bad results, and the next 2 years saying they're just getting started while making promises that they can only fulfill if you vote them back in. Then before you know it, a 10-year target is within sight, and by that time it's too late to substantially change the emissions trajectory, and we don't meet it. Bill 38 is important in that regard, as it aims to cut through those excuses and get right to the heart of the matter, shortening the timescale and increasing transparency on an annual basis. For example, Honourable Speaker, with the interim targets, again, we'll be able to, through them, evaluate progress before 2030. It shows they'll show whether or not we're on track. If we are, great. That adds credibility to government plans so that they can continue their course. And if not, they're going to have to explain to the general public why they're not on track and what they're going to do to get on track, or what has changed since they initially said they would be on track. By reporting emissions annually, the public will get a better sense where emissions originate, what policies are being worked on, what are not being worked on, as equally as important, how they all align amongst themselves, and how they align in terms of the next fiscal forecast. The existing Climate Change Accountability Act, Honourable Speaker, also already has a provision that allowed the minister to establish sectoral targets, but it's written as an option. That's in section 1.4, I think it is. It says this: the minister may, by order, establish greenhouse gas emissions targets for individual sectors instead of a requirement. So, and that hasn't been used to date. And so this act is actually requiring it and is actually important in terms of ensuring that. And that's particularly relevant as we know that a commitment to set sectoral targets was included in the minister's mandate letter and in the 2017 BC NDP election platform. So it should be no surprise that it's included in Bill 38, although admittedly there was some to and fro trying to ensure that this actually happened over the last few months. The idea, Honourable Speaker, of sectoral targets is not new. It's being used in places like New Zealand, in Australia, Germany, in the UK, for example, to help guide government, guide policymakers, and give transparency so that people know, the direction government's heading. In New Zealand and in Australia, Victoria, the state of Victoria, they have some very good proxy policies that we have that compare well and directly with the policies here, and particularly to what's being done in this bill, but also in terms of the size of the population of the jurisdictions there. Now, I understand, Honourable Speaker, the government has extensive consultation plans to ensure the targets are set at a correct level, these sectoral and these interim targets, and that these balance the realities of our current emissions rates and the reduction rates necessary to meet our legislated targets. But ultimately, Honourable Speaker, this bill is about good governance in the face of what can only be described as the single greatest challenge this planet has ever seen, and I spin that and say it's also the greatest opportunity for innovation humans have ever seen, and frankly, our province has ever faced. We're so fortunate to live in a province like British Columbia, which is quite literally the most beautiful place in the world to live. Now, I've lived in I agree. I've lived in many countries in the world, whether it be in Germany or in England or Scotland or Australia or in the United States or even out in other parts of Canada. And I have traveled extensively around the world, from Asia through all over the world. I can say unequivocally, in my view, this is the best place to live. This is a beautiful jurisdiction, and that is one of our strategic advantages, Honourable Speaker. We are literally can attract and retain the best and brightest in the world to British Columbia because of the quality of life and the stable democracy that we can offer. This is a strategic choice that I'm hoping this government will continue to build on as we start to deal with the climate issue and through the transparency associated with this bill. We also have a highly skilled and educated workforce. As we all know from the international PISA assessment exams, British Columbia ranks at the very top, above the much-touted Finland, at the very top in reading, writing, and mathematics. Remarkable that we have some of this quality education here. We also have outstanding post-secondary institutions. So we know that companies not only can attract and retain the best and brightest, but they have access to a highly skilled and educated workforce. And we also have boundless renewable energy, fiber, and water, like no other jurisdiction in the world, Honourable Speaker. What an incredible opportunity for innovation using these strategic strengths. And I could pivot back to exactly that when I just met today with the Canadian Manufacturing Association. And for so long, I've been trying to get both this and the previous government to recognize the opportunities for manufacturing in this province. Imagine this. We're fixated on delivering corporate welfare to LNG Canada, where we actually give them steel tariff exemptions. You try the manufacturers getting steel tariff exemptions. Exemptions from a carbon tax. Below market electricity. I could go on and on and on. But what we're not doing is sending the signal that, look, manufacturing, there is clean manufacturing that happens in the world. We should be doing it in BC, and we should be doing it in rural BC, because we have a railway line that connects Prince Rupert, deep port, closest port to Asia on the coast, and Chicago, the same line goes between the two in the eastern US, which is the gateway to Eastern America. What an opportunity, strategic opportunity for manufacturing and clean manufacturing, because we have access to renewable energy like no one else does. But that requires a vision. That requires a signal to be sent to industry that we're not just hewers of wood and drawers of water, that we actually believe in value added and innovation. We actually believe in recognizing environmental challenges are really nothing more than economic opportunities. And we have the wherewithal, the skill, the innovation, the creativity, the people, the smarts to deal with these challenges here in BC if, and only if, government sends the right signals. It doesn't send the right signals when it continues to provide subsidies for sunset industries that benefit a few multinational shareholders and maybe in the short term give a small economic stimulus to a region that will then suffer shortly thereafter because of the traditional economic booms and busts of commodity cycles. You know, transitioning to a carbon-free world, a carbon-neutral world, doesn't mean we have to go back to the dark ages, Honourable Speaker. It means transforming and transitioning to a cleaner, sustainable society where economic, social, and environmental concerns are central to all of our decision-making. There should be a time when we don't actually need a Ministry of Environment, where we actually think about the Ministry of Finance is thinking about general progress indicators that span beyond the single silo that is GDP and move beyond to recognize that we judge success as a society not so much by the GDP per debt ratio, but more so by general progress indicators that talk about things like the quality of education, the quality of the environment, whether people can live and work in the same community, the child welfare rates. This is what successful societies will be defined on, but that requires, again, a change in the thinking of many of our decision makers today. You know, what I'm describing here is it's not impossible, Honourable Speaker. It's grounded in current economic trends, scientific evidence, and frankly, best practice in jurisdictions. We have so much to gain, Honourable Speaker. It's not just possible that the transition to a clean economy could create jobs. It's frankly inevitable. Jobs that are inspired, important, sustainable, valuable, and you just have to go, Honourable Speaker, to a place like Portable Electric in Vancouver and see the smiles on the faces of the people who work there, the young millennials, who come to work every day and feel like they're making the world a better place, building replacements for diesel generators based on lithium-ion storage technology that's BC-based. And sadly, if we don't actually start to nurture these BC-based companies, they'll fall into the valley of death and not get out of it. So let's start to think about the opportunities we have here. It's an incredible company that is a BC success story that we must nurture instead of having it, as so many of our companies do, get bought up and moved to other jurisdictions. BC-based innovation, BC-based families got together, BC engineers, BC people working there, high-paid jobs, excited to go to work, and they even have, Honourable Speaker, Hawaii Shirt Day that I was able to participate in. So a great place to work, I'm sure. You know, this is what Bill 38 is about, actually, frankly. It's to assist a process that allows us on focusing on transitioning our economy that works for all of us in a manner that is transparent and governments will be held accountable as through the measures outlined in Bill 38. These are policies that must be based on principles and evidence, not political calculation and opportunism. And as government leaders, we must collectively, Honourable Speaker, do everything we can to develop policies that promote, rather than hinder, innovation in our economy. Governments often talk a lot about competitiveness, saying if we ask too much of companies, they'll leave. But I've never understood why we want to be competing with other jurisdictions who are willing to sacrifice their clean air, their land, and their water, or willing to commit human rights abuses, all in order to see who can extract their resource cheaper and faster. Our resource sector, Honourable Speaker, as we're setting the sectoral targets embedded within Bill 38, should view this not as something to shy away from, but it is an incredible opportunity yet again. Tech can start to think, one of our staple industries in BC, can start to think about ways that it can do what it's doing in more efficient and cleaner ways, knowing that if they can dig dirt out of the ground in a more efficient and cleaner way, they're saving money, and they're developing technology that others will want to use as well. This is what innovation, this is where signals like this send to innovation. It's not about telling mining companies, be gone. It's about saying to companies, innovate. And we're there to support you in that, and we're there to ensure that you are successful in doing so. And again, I come back to tech. When you go into the communities whose livelihoods depend on the mining there, they are the strongest advocates for these companies because they understand that they have to live there. And then when you have good corporate citizens like Teck, for example, in the Elk Valley, the people of the Elk Valley, they'll have some complaints about this and that, but by and large, they like the fact that their company is concerned about the environment in which they live, and they're some of their strongest advocates. With that said, I'm confronted and deeply challenged by the knowledge that as we stand debating here this, what I believe, a truly valuable piece of legislation, work is beginning on LNG Canada, single biggest point source of greenhouse gas emissions in provincial history. The irony is not lost on me, and frankly, I don't think it's going to be lost on others, because the disconnection between politicians' words and actions on climate is something I hope will be addressed by this bill so that people can point to this later and say, you said this, and look at this. You did not follow through. You claimed you could get a 40% reduction by 2030, and you claimed you can also add the single biggest point source of greenhouse gas emissions in BC's history. Look what you've done. History will judge those leaders accordingly. I'm tired, frankly, Honourable Speaker, of hearing touching speeches from members in this room and elsewhere when communities are threatened by forest fires or when species are threatened to extinction, only to see every single member in this House, whether they be on government side or the opposition side, stand to advance the corporate subsidy that embodies the past for the future as well, the corporate welfare associated with things like LNG Canada. Now, I spoke to a clean energy conference last week, and I asked them, how many of you wind energy companies have ever had a steel tariff exemption on your windmills? Zero. Yet we think what we need to do here is give a major and these are small companies. They're not the big, Shell Internationals. But we think it's okay to give billions of dollars of subsidies to multinationals whose interests are not ours. Those interests are clearly the shareholders of the multinationals. And many of those shares reside in other jurisdictions. I just give my head a shake. And I know history will judge very harshly legislators in this place for the decisions that they didn't make. Not so much for the decisions that they did make, but for the decisions that they didn't make. And that will be one that I think will come back to haunt people in the years ahead. As I was writing this speech with my staff, I received a copy of a Globe and Mail article, and this is what the heading said, Honourable Speaker. It said this: Alberta, BC to advocate for Canadian natural gas in Asia. The subheading was this: two provinces which are in, quote, absolute alignment over the matter will send officials to Tokyo to make the case for accessing the Asian market. Really? We have a government that has committed to 40% greenhouse gas reductions by 2013, bringing in important legislation to ensure accountability. And we have Canadian, British Columbian people going out there touting enhanced expansion of LNG. There needs to be some internal soul searching, because I'm not sure that the left hand in this government actually knows what the right hand is doing, or whether the right hand knows what the left hand is doing, because clearly you can't have it both ways. Sweden's, it was also published in that same day, actually. It was an article in Reuters about Sweden. Think about this. This is the signal we're sending. It says this, the article in Reuters said this: Sweden's central bank sells off bonds from Canadian province over climate concerns. Further stating this: Sweden's central bank said on Wednesday it had sold off bonds from the oil-rich Canadian province of Alberta and parts of Australia because it felt that greenhouse gas emissions in both countries were too high. This is the actual economic dilemma that we are facing as we continue to think that somehow we're going to build an economy on the resources that others are weaning themselves off of. Riksbank Deputy Governor Martin Floden said the bank would no longer invest in assets from issuers with a larger carbon footprint, even if the yields were high. You're seeing the divest movements across North America. You're seeing other jurisdictions move in this regard. And the article continues. It said this: Australia and Canada are countries that are not known for good climate work. Imagine that, Honourable Speaker. We are known internationally as brokers of peace, or historically we were. And now we're known not as jurisdictions with good climate policy. Greenhouse gas, the article says this: greenhouse gas emissions per capita are among the highest in the world, he said in the speech to Örebro University in Sweden. You know, I think, frankly, as a society, we need to, and particularly as government, grow up a little bit and recognize that, you know, what was once good for us is not good for us anymore. And I'm sad to say, for fossil fuels, we're at that point. The writing's been on the wall, and again, I've been in this field since the 1980s. It's not like I've seen anything that we haven't been saying for at least, what, almost 35 years. Politicians have a moral responsibility to think further into the future and govern not just for their term, but also for their children and grandchildren. For those who are not here to be part of the decision-making process today, we make decisions that they have to live the consequences of, yet we don't have to live those consequences. And for me, what matters is how history judges us. And I will say, sadly, in Canada, in this building, history will look very sorely on a number of people who have not made this a priority and continue to push the fossil fuel agenda. Bill 38, the Climate Change Accountability Amendment Act before us today, does demonstrate, Honourable Speaker, that minority governments, despite glaring differences, can move beyond political rhetoric and collaborate on ambitious climate legislation. I truly believe that the Minister has the very best intentions with this legislation, and that government has come to recognize now that, in fact, economic prosperity is not going to be found in the continuing corporate welfare that is the natural gas sector in our province. But we can't leave those jurisdictions high and dry. And that is why I've continued to try to articulate the importance of issues like forestry, value-added, mining, innovation in those sectors, and the manufacturing sectors, and our use and access to clean energy like no other jurisdiction. But the barriers for innovation in there, Honourable Speaker, lie squarely within BC Hydro, and the fact that the standing offer program has been shut down, and that jurisdictions and Indigenous communities from north to south and east to west have projects stalled where they wanted to get themselves off diesel, where they wanted to bring prosperity into their communities. And that will be my next challenge over the coming months, is to try to ensure that we get on track with BC Hydro, to ensure that we actually start to allow for the innovation in that sector. Because the days of big dams are gone. Big dams are good for storage, sure, but so are old rock quarries that you could fill with water and have pumped hydro. There's lots of brownfield sites in this province that could be used for water storage as well, some of which are right near the ocean. You know, our federal leaders have been similarly called upon just recently now, Honourable Speaker, to unite in a minority government to address the issue of climate change, as we have done here in this province with Clean BC. Hopefully, it too will try to stimulate innovation in industry to compensate for jobs being shed in the sunset oil and gas sector. Direct clean tech advancements in transportation, housing to conserve energy in our daily lives, and harnessing the advancements in clean tech to cut emissions and reduce pollution. You know, Honourable Speaker, I reluctantly began this journey from a climate scientist to a politician in 2012, I first announced. But when I did, I told myself I would speak truth to power on this file. I would call government out if they weren't following through with that. And that's something that I think I've done over the last 6 years. You don't need me to do that anymore, Honourable Speaker. There are millions of students in the streets now calling out government around the world, led by Greta Thunberg. In my view, the single most rewarding thing I've had as a climate scientist was to be able to stand in the back on that legislative lawn a few weeks back with my cane, because I had double vision and I was dizzy as anything, watching that must have been 20,000 students and others on the lawn calling upon government for climate action. The children have spoken, Honourable Speaker. The people have spoken. The voters have spoken. Chantal Hébert summarizes it best. She said this on election night federally. This should be the last election that any party in this country believes it can win without having a serious plan for climate change. Now, I would say that's true in the province of British Columbia as well. And I look forward as we watch as the next provincial election comes and I'm on the sidelines, being a member of no party because I'll go back into a nonpartisan role, watching the BC Liberals and the BC NDP and the BC Greens fight over each other as to who has got the best climate plans. And rest assured, I'll provide a very frank, nonpartisan assessment of all three. And I hope that each one strives to be better than the other, and the arguments then end up being, who's got the best plan? Ours is better than yours because, not axe to tax, not yours is terrible, but ours is better. Given the tripartisan creation of this amended bill over many, many years, with respect to the legacy that was shown by the BC Liberals in 2007 and 2008, I trust it will be passing with all party support. And again, I conclude by thanking the Minister and the Premier for taking this issue seriously and putting together the transparency, the accountability, and the substance in this bill to ensure that not only this, but future governments are held accountable for their promises and words on this very important file. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.